Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Miss Laurie Calhoun about humanitarian intervention. Ms. Calhoun is a philosopher and cultural critic. She is the author of War and Delusion, A Critical Examination, and of We Kill Because We Can, From Soldiering to Assassination in the Drone Age. You can follow her work on her blog, The Drone Age, at thedroneage.wordpress.com, and you can find her on Twitter at Laurie L. Calhoun, with Laurie spelled Laurie. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/humanitarian-intervention. Laurie, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for joining me. So since we're going to be talking about humanitarian intervention today, a logical place to start would be with a definition, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So what do you mean by humanitarian intervention?
Okay, humanitarian intervention is a label which has been applied to military intervention since the 1999 bombing of Kosovo by NATO. And the label itself, in my own view, is both misleading and rhetorically seductive. So you call something humanitarian intervention, and it's hard to see how someone can oppose it, particularly politicians who are concerned about what's going to show up in the headlines, and also just the populace more generally. Because if you try to say, "Oh, I'm against humanitarian intervention," it sounds like, "Oh, I'm for inhumanitarian intervention," or it sounds like I'm against humanity, or it just sounds it's rather like denying that murder is wrong. You know, you can't. It's hard to object to it. But as it's been carried out in history so far, it's involved the bombing of people who have been victimized by people on the ground in their homelands. So it's really been a matter of bombing campaigns, and it's called humanitarian intervention under this rubric of R2P. They call it responsibility to protect civilians on the ground, and it's a relatively new phenomenon in history. It only came about after the end of the Cold War.
Okay, now you mentioned the Kosovo War in there as being maybe the first example of this. But there were some actions earlier in the 90s in Somalia, and then I suppose some people might point to Rwanda as an instance where they wish more of an effort to undergo humanitarian intervention had taken place. But what are some of the key examples since the 90s and even before?
Well, since the 90s, quite recently was the 2011 bombing of Libya, which was sold as a humanitarian intervention. We were told that if the United States did not intervene through NATO, that there would be a genocide. So under that assumption, Obama took action, bombed away, and eventually Muammar Gaddafi, the leader, was killed and deposed. So that was called a case of humanitarian intervention. You're right that Rwanda was, in a way, the starting point of this phenomenon, and that's because action wasn't taken in Rwanda. So the Rwandan genocide in 1994 was really horrific. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in only a period of weeks. And a lot of people said, why didn't we do anything? We need to do something about this. We need to change our way of looking at foreign policy so that we're ready to intervene when people are being slaughtered in their homelands, even when it doesn't affect our national interest. So Rwanda has been used as this kind of, poster of where we should be intervening to help people. The problem is that the Rwanda case, in a way, is a red herring because it's not at all clear that the sort of thing that's called humanitarian intervention right now, bombing, would have helped in Rwanda. So Rwanda was a horrible massacre, but it was perpetrated using machetes. So it would have been very difficult to stop what happened through bombing without also killing the people who were being pursued. So it's hard to see how bombing would have helped in that case, but it has been used as the example over and over again. Look at Rwanda, we can't allow that to happen again. So now we must intervene to prevent a genocide.
Yeah, and forgetting some of the other moral factors for a moment and just looking at this on a utilitarian level, has there ever been an instance where humanitarian intervention has been called for and has been carried out in a way that those calling for it would consider effective? As in, there was some horrible atrocity going on, and the intervention led to that atrocity stopping or at least being reduced, and the damage elsewhere was minimal. Has that ever actually been the case?
Well, people say that has been the case. For example, Hillary Clinton, who was a strong advocate of the intervention in 2011, during the first Democratic presidential debate, she actually went so far as to say that the intervention in Libya in 2011 was, quote, smart power at its best. So she considered that to be a success story, even though somewhat, later on, several months later, Obama came out and said that, in fact, his failure to prepare for the aftermath of the removal of Gaddafi was his worst mistake in his presidency. So a little bit of conflicting, evaluation of the efficacy of that intervention. But yeah, people always say initially that, oh, look what we did, we saved all these people. The people particularly who advocate intervention always view it in the most positive possible light. It's hard to do these utilitarian analyses because they cover a period of time. So you might say, okay, at this moment in time, it looks like the Kosovo intervention was good. We stopped Slobodan Milosevic. But then how do things look, later on down the line, when the society starts fragmenting again because none of the issues were really addressed through the bombing. None of the sources of contention were addressed. And so the utilitarian analysis, it all comes down to the slice of time you decide to look at. My own view is that if you do a long-term analysis of any of these conflicts, you find out that, in fact, bombing is inevitably going to lead to more bombing later on down the line, and it doesn't address the root causes of these conflicts, particularly when they have persisted for centuries.
Right, and since you mentioned Kosovo and Libya, one common theme between those interventions was in the lead-up, the way the leaders of those countries were portrayed. Maybe not the leader of Kosovo, but Milosevic is the leader of
right.
Serbia. You always seem to have this good versus bad, very black and white situation being played out. You see comparisons to Hitler or whatever monster from history they want to make comparisons to at that time. Is this always the case in humanitarian interventions where we see this sort of propaganda played out of good versus bad, or are there some cases where maybe humanitarian interventions are called for, but we don't see this good versus bad being discussed in as stark of terms?
I think that the people advocating for bombing always reach for the strongest, the most powerful metaphors and analogies. And Hitler, of course, is the number one example. If you want to go to war, just call someone Hitler, and then suddenly everyone feels obliged to get behind you. So, for example, in the 1999 NATO bombing of Kosovo, there were a number of people ordinarily disposed to oppose war who lined up to support that intervention because Slobodan Milosevic was painted as the Hitler du jour, and basically the claim was made that if you don't intervene, then you're going to be responsible for something that's the magnitude of Hitler's massacre. So it's it's very rhetorically persuasive to paint these conflicts as Manichaean battles between good and evil, when in fact that's completely false in all of these cases. In all of these cases, there have been atrocities committed by both sides, or all sides, I should say, in the Kosovo, Serbian, Croatian situation. And what happens is the international community looks at this moment in time and says, okay, who committed the latest atrocity, and then paints that person, in this case Slobodan Milosevic, as Hitler, and then says we have to act to stop this new incarnation of Hitler. In fact, it's never like that in reality. So there's always a long story, a long chronology, which explains why one side is trying to slaughter the other side, and it usually involves the fact that the other side has been slaughtering, their people. So, in a case like that, it went on for centuries. It's not as though this just suddenly happened, out of the blue. Slobodan Milosevic started, murdering people. No, lots of people have been murdering each other over centuries. But I can't think of a case where the people who are promoting bombing actually look at both sides in a judicious way. I mean, a good example is Syria right now. So the people who want to get rid of Assad are saying, oh, he's like Hitler, right? So we have to, again, get rid of this guy because he's the root cause of the war in Syria. So you don't, although, Assad has supporters. So on the other side, there are people who oppose the bombing, the removal of Assad, but the ones who actually want to get rid of Assad always are going to call him Hitler or something like that.
Right. So is this portrayal of good and evil and the prevalence of that narrative, is that what leads many people who might be skeptical of military interventions in most cases to support military interventions when it has the humanitarian label behind it?
Well, I think they get seduced by the rhetoric, and I think that it's easy to be tricked by the labels. Again, when you call something humanitarian intervention, it's hard to say, oh, I oppose humanitarian intervention. Particularly, it's difficult for politicians to do so. So politicians are going to support this as well. It goes right along with this this liberal tendency to focus more on the surface than the deep content. I don't know if I can come up with another example of it, but it definitely appeals to liberals. So I've been thinking a lot about the Brexit controversy. I'm here in the UK, and there's been this outpouring of people who say, oh, the EU is all good and all this stuff, and so it becomes a sort of trope that's carried by people, like, we have to do this because this is what good people do, and we are right and moral people, and so we have to do this. And that's what happens with humanitarian intervention as well. The people who oppose it are painted as somehow morally remiss. If you don't want to go save these people, how can you not want to save people from their evil leader? Is how it's painted. And so that makes it look as though you're going to have blood on your hands if you don't intervene.
Right, and yet, and this really gets to sort of the core, one of the core aspects of warfare. But in war, it's the way that we view killing and the way that we view violence and property destruction, harm against others, really changes. And the term humanitarian intervention is very much an oxymoron, and it's very much something that sort of covers up what's really going on, which is the killing and the violence against all of these people. Why? Now, I guess this is a very foundational question, and might be difficult to answer in some ways. But why is it that in warfare the way we view killing, or the way many people view killing, changes? And then that, of course, is carried over into humanitarian interventions, where maybe the maybe the killings by some leader on the other side of the world are not okay, but then additional killings are. Why is the perception that way?
My own view is that this derives from the just war tradition and the focus on intention. So the entire framework of humanitarian intervention, and also just the pro-military, pro-bombing view in general, presupposes a really false theory of intention, because states don't possess intentions. Only individual people possess intentions. But what happens when we go to war, when people call for wars, they say, oh, we have to do this for this noble reason. And so even though there are lots of other reasons behind bombing, one of which is, profiting from war, if you're in the industry, what happens is the noblest of all possible individual intentions is held up as the reason for the war. And then the reason why I blame this on just war theory is because they have it has a clause or a doctrine called double effect, according to which the morality of your action is determined by your intention. It's not determined by the consequences. So we'll take a case like Vietnam, where we killed millions of people, many civilians. And the idea is like, okay, that's supposed to be all right because we didn't intend to kill those people. We intended only to kill bad guys. And so in the process, we did, it's true, kill some innocent people. But it's supposed to be okay in this framework because the morality of our actions is always determined by our intentions, and we had good intentions. The problem with that framework is, of course, that both sides of every conflict believe themselves to have good reasons for doing what they're doing. So in a way, it's completely vacuous. The doctrine of double effect doesn't really distinguish good intentions from bad intentions, or just military action from unjust military action at all. All it does is it serves as a salve to the conscience of the killers. So that's why we can go and bomb these places to smithereens, leave, country after country in shambles: Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and do it all in good conscience because, we only intended to get rid of the bad guys. And yeah, as a side effect, okay, it's true, we destroyed these societies, but we can still sleep at night and go on to the next country.
Right, and then they'll use the term collateral damage to maybe try to hide what took place with the killings of all of those people, or to make it sound less severe.
That's right. It's all euphemism and the use of anodyne language that completely masks the reality of what we're doing. So, as you know, I have this book on drone killing, and they call incinerating a human being with a Hellfire missile engaging him, right, or splashing him. I mean, in fact, what you're doing is horrific if you look at the details of what's being done to these human beings. But it's all couched in this very euphemistic language, and it just hides the reality of what we're doing. It no longer seems like mass murder. It just seems like, national self-defense.
Right. Now, I want to return to something you said earlier about just war theory. First of all, can you give sort of a brief overview of what just war theory is, just so that everyone knows? But and I don't want to dig too deeply into this because this could be a whole episode in and of itself. But the conventional wisdom amongst many seems to be that just war theory has helped to prevent some conflicts from breaking out, or at least conflicts from growing and from expanding across a region and across various areas. So why is just war theory to blame in the case of humanitarian intervention in some instances for expanding and growing conflicts when the conventional narrative is that it does the opposite?
Well, I reject the conventional narrative completely. I believe that just war theory has been used as a rhetorical tool by leaders wishing to go to war, and it's been done for centuries. And that's the line of the just war theorist, is that it actually restrains leaders. I believe that's exactly the opposite of what it does. I believe that it provides leaders with a template for rationalizing their use of military force, because there's a list of requirements, use ad bellum requirements. If you want to go to war, you have to satisfy these requirements. Turns out the requirements are almost banal. A just war has to have a just cause. Well, that's tautological. I mean, or pleonastic. And a just war must be waged by a legitimate authority. Well, the people who call for war are commander-in-chief of big armies, so they're legitimate authority. So that's vacuously fulfilled. The war, probably the worst requirement, at least looking at it in the modern world, is last resort, because last resort is possibly never fulfilled in the modern world. I mean, there are always other things you can do, but leaders just say that, oh, this is last resort. There's nothing else we can do. We have to go to war. And then people say, oh, okay, all right, so I guess we have to go to war. So I believe that just war theory has not restrained or constrained leaders at all. And there's lots of evidence for this. For example, the 1991 Gulf War was said to be a just war by George H.W. Bush. So he said, look, we've satisfied all these requirements. It's just cause, last resort. We have good intention. I'm a legitimate authority. And so then they went to war. So what did they do when they went to war? Well, they bombed water treatment facilities. They destroyed, in the end, when all was said and done, I think over 500,000 children were killed as a result of the 1991 Gulf War because the water treatment facilities were destroyed and then sanctions were imposed which prevented access to medicine needed to treat the diseases that were caused by the filthy water. So when you look at the actual modus operandi of the warriors, once they get the go-ahead, okay, so we can go to war, then they do things that completely conflict with the whole idea of the just war paradigm. For example, burying Iraqi soldiers alive in their trenches. Okay, so now just war theorists, they come back and say, oh, well, the fact that they didn't observe all of the requirements of just war theory doesn't invalidate just war theory. It just shows that they made some mistakes. But the problem is that all these leaders need is to go through the checklist of items, and then they get the go-ahead to go to war, and then they do whatever they want to do. So I believe exactly the opposite of the quote-unquote conventional wisdom on just war theory. And I'm happy to say that the Vatican seems to be coming out against just war theory, to everyone's amazement. This happened only this spring, where they're looking to focus more toward an advocation of pacifism than just war, because they recognize that just war theory can be used by any leader in any way they want. A good example is Barack Obama, who actually says that his drone targeting killing program of assassination is permissible by the tenets of just war theory.
That's interesting. It's interesting that the Vatican would come out in that way with that opinion.
It is.
And very surprising.
It's surprising and it's fantastic. It's highly welcome in my view, because I've been arguing about this for 15 years. I've been saying this against the grain, going against the grain, standing up to just war theorists such as Michael Walzer and saying, no, in fact, just war theory is not preventing wars. It's actually providing leaders with a template for war. I've been saying this for 15 years, so I was thrilled when this development emerged earlier this year.
Yeah, definitely. So let's return to the subject of utilitarianism. Now, we briefly touched on this earlier, but just so everyone's clear, what is utilitarianism, and then how are opponents of humanitarian intervention and other war-making activities, how are they actually long-run utilitarians, might we say, long-term utilitarians, whereas those who advocate for humanitarian intervention might be more short-term utilitarians?
Okay, sure. Utilitarianism is a normative theory according to which the action you should take is the one that will maximize the happiness or utility of the greatest number of people. Okay, so utility is, you could just say in the case of war, a proxy for utility would just be like lives. So you're going to save more lives if you go to war than if you don't go to war. So yes, humanitarian interventionists always appeal to this idea that if we don't go intervene, then more people are going to be slaughtered. There will be this massive genocide if we don't go stop them now. And it's true, we're going to kill a few people along the way. But the net benefit will be for humanity, because we will save more people than would have been saved had we not intervened. That's their argument. Now, from the perspective of a war opponent such as myself, taking the longer view, the long-range utilitarian view would be that, in fact, every time we go bomb one of these places, we're holding bombing up as an example of how to resolve conflict. So there are lots of examples. There's lots of evidence, I believe, for the thesis that, in fact, we promote war by bombing all of these various places. So you might say, for example, that some of these people in the homeland who are angry about this or that or the other thing and go out and massacre a bunch of people, in a way they're following the example of their government, because that's how the government is now resolving conflict. So it affects us, I think, in the domestic realm as well, but especially internationally. When you say that this is what you do, you have a conflict, so this is what you do, you go kill people, then other people are going to follow that example. And we saw this all over post-colonial Africa.
Yeah, sure. What does international law say about all of this, if anything?
About
humanitarian interventions and carrying them out.
Well, there is some hope on the part of some of the advocates of humanitarian intervention that they will do some work on preventative lines. And so there was a conference, in fact, on R2P, responsibility to protect, quite recently. I think it was in South Korea, where some of the speakers, of course, are saying, we need to do more preventive work, so to prevent these scenarios from arising in the first place. But the reality is that gets hardly any airtime, and it gets hardly any resources, because what gets the attention of states are places where they can go bomb. So they're not so interested in preemptively keeping the peace as they are in going in after the peace has already been disrupted and then, bombing some more. My own view is it's a little bit crazy, because when you go bomb people who are being bombed, it's similar to treating a cut on your hand by slicing it with a thicker knife. I mean, I don't really understand how bombing is supposed to alleviate the conflict, except by eliminating some of the people. And so, yeah, if you wipe out all the people, or you render their entire society uninhabitable, which is what's happening in Syria, then, okay, eventually you're going to solve the conflict, because no one will want to live there anymore. But what you have instead is a massive exodus of refugees. So this is what the whole EU crisis was caused by, the exodus of Syrian refugees, and that was caused because they can't live in their own homeland. So this bombing approach to solving conflict always fails, it seems to me. Now, it's hard to say on the international law front. It's hard to know what to say, because since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, international law has been completely ignored by the United States and everyone else. So, for example, in Syria, it's almost a free-for-all. Anyone could go bomb Syria right now. You don't have to declare war. You don't have to go to the UN Security Council, because they're all following the example of the United States, which I guess is a good example of what I was talking about. We lead by example.
Right, and to your point about what we've seen in Syria and Libya and elsewhere, is when these humanitarian interventions take place, rather than alleviating the conflict or reducing the genocide, we see the conflicts getting bigger, and we see more people affected, more families affected, more communities affected.
That's right. And if you look at the numbers, for example, Libya, all these hundreds of it's got to be thousands by now of refugees attempting to get away and drowning, right? Those people are dead because their society was bombed and their leader was deposed, which led to a huge power vacuum and all sorts of conflict and violence. So if you actually did a utilitarian analysis, I don't know where Hillary Clinton got her idea that it was smart power at its best. I think she was just measuring that in terms of soldiers lost. So we didn't lose any U.S. soldiers. But if you look at the number of Libyans who have lost their lives since 2011, since the bombing by NATO under a humanitarian pretext, it's really laughable to claim that we've done something noble.
Sure, and of course we always see unintended consequences and blowback and other horrible effects from the expansion of these conflicts.
And the thing that is ironic is that although they're unintended, they're fully to be expected. This is going to happen. If you go bomb a country to smithereens, then hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of the inhabitants are going to, try to escape the bombing, which is perfectly rational. It happened in Iraq when during the occupation, millions of Iraqis fled because of the security problems. And it's happening all over the Middle East. I mean, Yemen, Somalia, all of these places where people can leave, they do leave.
Yeah, sure. Now, I want to return to the whole notion of the duty behind humanitarian interventions and sort of the moral obligation that those in favor of humanitarian interventions advocate. What is the connection between this sort of moral obligation and positive rights, and what's wrong with that way of thinking about all of this?
Okay, there are, I believe, three different problems on a theoretical level. One involves killing versus letting die, one involves negative versus positive rights, and the third one just involves ought implies can. So let's take killing versus letting die. In civil society, we draw a sharp distinction between killing and letting die. So if someone dies, but you did not physically cause that person's death, you are not held accountable. The only possible examples here are parents and physicians who have special duties to their own children and patients. But in general, if someone dies, you are not responsible unless you physically caused that death. So the example I talk about in War and Delusion is the fact that homeless people sometimes die in our streets in the winter because they freeze to death. Well, it turns out there are lots of empty houses and empty apartments, but no one says, oh, you people who have these vacant houses, you're actually responsible for the death of this person who died in the street because he could have slept in your house. No one says that. So we hold up this distinction between killing and letting die. And closely related are negative versus positive rights. So you have a right not to be killed, but do you have a duty to keep someone alive? So this is all, this is very contentious between liberals and conservatives, whether we actually have to keep people alive, even in our own society, whether we have to feed people, keep them from starving to death. But we do absolutely draw a distinction between helping people and helping them charitably and actually taking what is theirs away. So we can't take someone's life away from him. So what happens in calls for humanitarian intervention is that the advocates for bombing or intervention, they want to forget about all these distinctions that we uphold in civil society. So suddenly killing and letting die, these are suddenly morally equivalent. If you don't go stop this murderous dictator from killing people, then you will have blood on your hands, is the argument. But we don't say that within civil society. So it ends up just being a pretext for war. Same thing with negative and positive duties. We don't feel, even though it would probably be good of us to help the people of Africa who don't have access to potable water, we don't feel that we have a moral obligation to do that. Certainly, we don't give that kind of aid in anything approximating the magnitude of military aid that we give to the same society. So we'll give lots and lots, billions of dollars in military aid to some of these societies, but we don't even get close to that amount in non-military aid. So what happens is suddenly we're supposed to think that it's just as bad to allow people to be killed as it is to kill them. And in fact, the humanitarian interventionists are so convinced of this that they're willing to kill some people in the process, to positively kill people in saving the lives of other people, again, according to a utilitarian analysis. And then the final principle that I draw on when I discuss humanitarian intervention is just ought implies can. Lots of people are being victimized right now while you and I are sitting here having this conversation. Do we have a duty to go save all of those people? Well, no, we can't save all those people, so we cannot possibly have a duty to save all those people. Ought implies can. You can't have a duty to do what it is impossible for you to do. So the humanitarian interventionist wants to say, look, I have located a place where we can do some good, so we have to go do this. And I want to say that there are lots of other places that you could have pointed to. For example, Democratic Republic of the Congo, which we completely ignored during their civil war over many, many years. And it's pick and choose. And it turns out that there are always these ulterior motives behind the calls for intervention in these places. I mean, usually there's some other pretext beyond morality at work, and that's how you can distinguish between the different cases.
Yeah, on the note of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I might be a little off on this, but I want to say that conflict has had more deaths, more casualties than any conflict since World War II.
You were right, as far as I know. As far as I know the numbers, yes, absolutely. And yet, do you see anything about it? Do you see anyone talking about it? Do you see any, calls for intervention? No.
Right, yeah. No, you don't see any calls for it there, but it's a truly horrific situation, of course. Yet most people probably have never even heard of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Well, part of it is that our society has become very risk averse. So we're willing to go bomb people as long as we don't have to sacrifice too many soldiers, or in the best case scenario, let's sacrifice no soldiers. For example, in Kosovo, no U.S. soldiers died. And they flew really high above the land when they dropped their bombs, so that they couldn't even be really shot down. So with the risk-averse society such as ours has become, we only want to intervene if we don't have to really sacrifice any soldiers in the process. So that's where drones have made the frequency of war much greater, because Obama now is bombing 7 different Muslim countries. And he's doing a lot of it using drones, and so he's not putting any U.S. soldiers' lives at risk when he uses drones. And so, basically he's fighting 7 different wars, and no one really stops him or puts up much of a fuss about it, because he's supposedly keeping the homeland safe, and he's the smart warrior who uses drones, and so he doesn't sacrifice any soldiers. But if you think about it, it's really preposterous that we should be at war with 7, in 7 different countries. This never happened before the end of the Cold War. This ability to fight war everywhere simultaneously only emerged after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, no, and it's just amazing how few people raise questions about it. But I want to turn to, before we wrap up, I want to turn to another conflict in Africa that was a big source of controversy about a decade ago, and it seems to have disappeared from mainstream media coverage, at least in the United States. But what exactly was the situation in Western Sudan and in Darfur, and what were the calls for humanitarian intervention there, and how would you evaluate the claims being made there?
Well, it was, a typical, I don't know, is there a typical civil war? People fighting one another over their territory. As you know, South Sudan became an independent country at the end of all of this. But for a long time, the humanitarian interventionists were absolutely calling for war there. And we never really had the kind of intervention that they wanted to see. But it was interesting because if you talk to the Sudanese themselves, there was a lot of controversy over whether there should be Western intervention. There was a really good film about this called All About Darfur, where the director went in and interviewed people and found that there were Sudanese who felt that Western nations, states, had an obligation to come in and resolve the conflict. But there were other Sudanese who said, no, we don't want you here. We've seen this song and dance before, this mission civilisatrice, where you're going to come in and save us from ourselves. There's always some imperial ambition behind it. We don't trust you. We don't want you to intervene. So basically, the Sudanese themselves were divided. I don't know what the proportions of, people for and against the intervention. But of course, the Western humanitarian interventionist advocates all said, we have to go, we have to go, we have to go. When you actually ask the people under attack whether they want to be further attacked, some of them are going to say, unsurprisingly, no, we don't want you to bomb us. And that was true also in Kosovo. But it was another case where the R2P crowd really tried to muster up support for an intervention. In the end, the conflict kind of settled down and South Sudan broke off, but now there's strife again. But the problem is in all of these cases is the bombing never addresses the sources of the factional strife, which leads to the violence. It just kills more people.
No, it absolutely does. And yet you still do have instances of genocide in some places, instances of horrible atrocities, horrible tragedies. So what should be done in those situations where you have these horrible atrocities that lead some people to call for humanitarian intervention? What would you advocate in the face of this sort of thing? And what do you think the individuals who are concerned about these areas should do and advocate for?
I believe that what humanitarian interventionists should advocate for is a complete cessation of the provision of weapons to these various countries and societies. So I think that that's the root cause of almost all of these conflicts is the never-ending flow of homicidal weapons to these places. And Obama has been really bad on this front. He has spread weapons all over the globe. And once people have weapons and they use them, it's not really difficult to understand. And I believe that humanitarian interventionists, rather than waiting for people to use the weapons provided to them by Western states, they should stand up and say, stop exporting these weapons. Don't provide these potential dictators with weapons. Don't provide these factions, the rebels in Syria. Don't provide these people with weapons. People worry about ISIS, but in fact, ISIS is a non-state entity. They have no weapons industry. Without the weapons provided to them by states, they would have no military power. And it seems kind of obvious, right? And yet we have people who are constantly advocating for providing weapons to the rebels in all these different scenarios. So my answer is stop exporting weapons to these places. These countries that could not engage in war without the weapons because they don't have a weapons industry. And yet they're able to do so because we provide them with weapons more readily than we'll provide them with, for example, potable water.
Well, and of course, one of the people who often advocates for providing various governments and rebel groups with weapons is Hillary Clinton. And of course, there's this election going on in the United States, and it's very likely, a near certainty, that either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump will be the next president. So what do you expect would happen under a Clinton or Trump administration as far as humanitarian interventions go?
Well, with Clinton, we have a case of a known, as Donald Rumsfeld might say. She advocates for war wherever there is an opening for war. So she is the hawk's hawk. She's absolutely a neocon. She may be a social liberal, but she, on the war front, she is the neocon's neocon. She's threatened Iran with nuclear obliteration. I mean, part of it is kind of this attempt to overcompensate and to show that she's really tough and tough enough to be a commander-in-chief. But part of it is just her natural tendency to support war. So it's hard to find a war that Hillary hasn't supported. So I think we have ample inductive evidence for projecting what a Clinton presidency would entail, and that would be more intervention. She's already said that she's going to continue the Obama policy. Well, the Obama policy is now bombing 7 different Muslim majority countries simultaneously. So if she wants to up the ante, maybe we'll be bombing 10 or 15 different countries. So that's Hillary. Hillary's a known entity. Trump is completely unpredictable. I call him, the known unknown. We really don't know what he's going to do. On a good day, he sounds great. On a good day, he sounds like someone I would want to vote for. He says, why do we have NATO? NATO was erected to counterbalance the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. So why do we have NATO? And he makes some very good points. NATO is always now searching for, it's always in a perpetual existential crisis. Why does NATO exist? Oh, well, look, we have a place where you can go in Libya. You can go bomb here. Good. NATO now has something to do. So Trump says these things that are often very sharp, and also his critique of the Iraq war, his willingness to say that we wasted trillions of dollars. I mean, we absolutely threw it away. We got nothing for it. So he has this businessman perspective. What did we get out of this deal? Nothing. We got negativity. So he says some lucid things on the foreign policy front, and he is abhorred by the neocons, who are now, of course, all backing Hillary. On the other hand, Trump occasionally says really irresponsible stuff that makes him sound very scary. He says things like, we're going to kill the families of terrorists. Well, it turns out Obama has already done that. He killed under Obama's authorization, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, the son of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed by drone. The son was killed 2 weeks after the father, even though, the father was also a suspect, and he was never indicted for crimes or anything, but he was killed. But then after killing Anwar al-Awlaki, who had been demonized, they killed the son as well. So when Trump says, we're going to kill the families of terrorists, I want to say, I think people should really talk about this example because it hasn't been discussed adequately. And so to answer your question, what would Trump be like? It's anyone's guess. That's the problem with Trump. I mean, on a good day, I think he sounds pretty good. But on a bad day, he sounds a little bit scary. So I think that no one can really predict what he's going to do. He does say some stuff that gives cause for hope. For example, he would talk to the leader of North Korea. He would talk to Putin. He says he will talk to anyone. And I think that's fantastic. What in the world could be wrong with talking to other leaders, even if they seem adversarial? Whereas I think Hillary would rather start World War III than, talk with Vladimir Putin, unfortunately.
Right. No, I agree with your assessment there. So we'll see how this plays out. It's a shame that Trump can't be more consistent.
That's right.
With some of these good insights that he has and good instincts that he sometimes has on the foreign policy front. But he's just so inconsistent and all over the map that.
He's inconsistent. And then what happens is his very unsavory little sound bites are blown up and repeated by the mainstream media over and over again. So it sounds like he's this really crazy person. They don't take the sound bites of sanity and do that. They only focus on the negativity. So that it seems like the media are really behind Hillary because they're constantly slamming him for every little misspoken utterance.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I want to thank you for joining me today. I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but that was a little while ago. So just to remind everybody, what are the best ways to follow your work?
Okay, well, I do have a book blog, which is covering particularly issues on the lethal drone front since the publication of We Kill Because We Can, From Soldiering to Assassination in the Drone Age. So the blog is thedroneage.wordpress.com. And I am on Twitter, but I have a contact page at my blog, so it's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay, great. And can you talk a little more about War and Delusion and what's contained in that book?
Oh, sure. War and Delusion is a book that I wrote over a period of more than 10 years because I published essay after essay after essay in an attempt to understand just war theory and why it has held such sway over so many centuries, even though war has transformed beyond recognition since Augustine and Aquinas. And so that book is primarily a critique of the just war paradigm, which is fully embedded in our pro-military view. And the first edition was published in 2013 by Palgrave Macmillan. I'm happy to say that the paperback, the softcover edition, will be reissued in September with a new foreword. I'm unhappy to say that nothing has happened to invalidate anything I wrote in the book, so it's just as relevant as it was when I published it 3 years ago. And I do have a foreword, as I said, which updates what's going on right now. But it's primarily, it's more of a scholarly work in that you kind of have to be interested in just war theory to want to delve into the intricacies of it and why I find it so deficient.
All right. Well, for those who are interested, and even for those who are not, the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/humanitarian-intervention. And there will be a link on there, of course, to probably multiple links, in fact, to War and Delusion and to We Kill Because We Can, and to the Drone Age, which is the blog, as well as the @Laurie Calhoun Twitter handle. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/humanitarian-intervention is the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or the podcatcher of your preference to make sure you never miss an episode, and to rate and review the show when you get a chance as well, especially on iTunes if that is your preferred podcatcher. And Laurie, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
Well, my pleasure. Obviously, it's a very controversial topic, and one that is not treated as a controversial topic in some instances. There seems to just sort of be a consensus around it. So I'm glad we were able to take a closer look, and I'd love to speak with you again sometime in the future.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.